Hey, thanks for joining us for another NWC Youth Live C Group lesson. If you've been with us the last couple of times, we are going through Styles' book Evangelism, and this is our third lesson in that series. So, just to give a quick recap to catch us up on what we've covered so far, week one, or lesson one, we covered just some basic definitions like what is the gospel and what is evangelism. And we saw that evangelism is really more than just the act of sharing the gospel. It encompasses a whole range of things we do to try and bring people into the kingdom. And we also covered a really, what I think is a very helpful four-part definition of the gospel or way of presenting the gospel that is built around four questions: who is God? Who are we? What has God done? And what can we do in response? The next week, we built off of that and looked at what it means to create a culture of evangelism. And there we just meant by culture of evangelism that evangelism becomes something we do all the time as a church and as a youth ministry. And so if you're interested in hearing more about that, I encourage you to either go ahead and look at those lessons on this YouTube channel or go to the NAOBC Youth Live homepage, click on the Take Home Materials tab, and then there you can find some PDFs that will give you both a summary of each lesson and also some reflection questions to think about the material that we covered. But that's the old stuff. That's what we've covered so far. What about today? Well, today the focus is going from building a culture of evangelism down to helping each of us individually to grow as evangelists. And here, Stiles identifies 5 prerequisites, he calls them. 5 things you need to have straight and ready to go before you can set out as an effective evangelist. So for this lesson, all we're going to do is I will list out those 5 things, make a few comments along the way, and that will be the whole kit and caboodle. So let's get going with Stiles' 5 prerequisites for sharing the gospel or becoming an evangelist. Number 1, prepare our hearts, minds, and feet. Prepare our hearts, minds, and feet. So what does Stiles mean by that? Well, let's break down each component. By prepare our hearts, Stiles has in mind here the fact that often we can be hindered in sharing the gospel for one of two reasons, and sometimes both together. On the one hand, you have just the fear that goes along with sharing the gospel, the fear of people responding badly, maybe the fear of us doing it badly. And then the other is a lack of desire, that maybe we aren't motivated to share the gospel. We don't see the urgency or the need to share the gospel. And here, I think Stiles is helpful in pointing out that having a culture of evangelism, where people are regularly sharing the gospel and telling stories about sharing the gospel, and having a partner to do evangelism with, those things can really help to orient our heart in the right way, both to see the excitement and urgency in sharing the gospel, and also to help us overcome the fear that often goes along with sharing the gospel. So that's preparing our hearts. But then what about preparing our minds? Well, this goes back, I think, to the very first lesson in helping us to think through what is the gospel and how do we share it with others. Because the reality is, if we don't have the content of the gospel clear in our own minds, it's going to be very difficult to convey the gospel to other people. And that's why I'd encourage you to go back to that first lesson and especially download the take-home material for that one, because it has some expanded notes on the gospel presentation method that Stiles uses and that we've actually used in the youth ministry for years. And I'd encourage you to look at that and maybe to even practice it. Practice it with a family member or a friend or alone in your room. Because here's the truth of the matter. The place and the time you don't want to have to figure out how to articulate the gospel well is when you are in an evangelistic situation. It's better to do some prep work beforehand so that when you're in the situation, you can at least in your own mind have the confidence of knowing you can articulate the gospel well. And I think that also helps with the fear that can sometimes well up in our hearts. So that's the first two parts. Now, what about the feet thing? What does it mean to repair your feet? Well, here, Styles means simply that we are available to share the gospel, that we're around unbelievers enough that we have a chance to engage them with a gospel conversation. And that when unbelievers are around us, we make ourselves available to them. And one thing I will add to Styles' point here, because I think it's correct, you can't really share the gospel with unbelievers if you're not around unbelievers. But often these things can be seasonal. And by that I mean sometimes you're in a season of life where you're around unbelievers more, and sometimes you're in a season of life where you're around unbelievers less. And that's not to excuse not doing evangelism in those seasons, but it is to say that I think the ebb and flow of life is such that sometimes you have more opportunities and sometimes you have less. So that's point one. It's kind of the biggest, most meaty point. The rest go a little bit more quickly. So number two is this: understand a gospel-shaped way of life. And here all Styles means is understanding in our minds and our hearts that evangelism is a lifestyle. And more than that, evangelism is part of the Christian lifestyle. You think of the Great Commission in Matthew 28. What is Jesus' last words to his disciples? Go and make more disciples. Do evangelism. And the truth of the matter is, if you're faithfully living the Christian life, if you have embraced the Christian lifestyle, sharing about the gospel with others is a part of that. Number three, slay our assumptions. And here, Styles is taking aim at one assumption in particular, the assumption that everybody inside of a church, everybody who shows up at a church, is a Christian. And I think Styles is right about this, that sometimes we can have this mentality that when we're in the church, we're in kind of this zone of Christians only. We're the only people who show up are Christians. And maybe we don't think that consciously, but maybe it's just in our default way of thinking about and engaging people. We just assume that they're Christians, when the truth of the matter is the church is filled with non-Christians. All the time, even back in the days of the apostles, non-Christians were in the church. And because of that, I think Styles is right that we need to be ready to engage in evangelism, both outside the church and inside the church. That's the first three. Number four, see evangelism as a discipline. Pretty much nobody is born a fantastic basketball player or a fantastic swimmer or a great piano player or an excellent public speaker or any number of dozens and hundreds and thousands of other skills. The truth is that to get good at those things requires practice and requires time and requires effort. And the same is true of many aspects in the Christian life. There are many aspects of the Christian life that are skills, and we tend to call them disciplines. Things like reading your Bible, things like praying. And these are things that we do, they're part of the Christian lifestyle, but they're also things that we can improve in over time with practice and effort. And Styles wants us to understand that evangelism is one of those things. Evangelism is something that you can and will improve in the longer you do it and the more you practice it. And number five is this, of his 5 prerequisites for sharing the gospel. God responds to our prayers. That is, we need to take prayer seriously. We need to understand that prayer is a key part of evangelism. because the truth is God does respond to our prayers. God hears our prayers, and that's what calms our hearts when they're filled with fear, or awakens our hearts when they're stuffed down with apathy. Prayer is what affects change in people's lives. Prayer is what empowers our words. Prayer is the bedrock of evangelism. So those are Styles' 5 prerequisites for sharing the gospel. 5 things we need to get straight in how we think and how we act in order to become lifestyle evangelists, effective evangelists, sharing the gospel. But there's one more thing I'd like to add, which Styles didn't include in his 5 points, but I think was a helpful note from this chapter, which is that good evangelists approach evangelism with a long-term relational view rather than a short-term presentation view. And here's what I mean by that. Rarely is anyone ever saved because they had a chance encounter at a bus stop with a Christian who shared the gospel with them once and then they both went their separate ways. Things like that hardly ever result in the salvation of somebody. Much more likely, much more common, is salvation that occurs because a non-believer forms a friendship and a bond with a Christian, and over time there is a trust and a care built there that eventually opens up into a willingness to hear, which eventually opens up into a heart ready to receive. And that's more what effective evangelism should be, not focusing on trying to present the gospel as much and as often and as quick as we can, but focusing on building relationships with unbelievers. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed that. I certainly got a lot out of this chapter. Look forward to hopefully discussing it with you all in one of our upcoming Zoom chats. Thanks.